Good morning, everyone. We are going to start actually in 1 minute just to make sure we have some more people to come in and view this webinar. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. So good morning and welcome to our webinar called Defining and Dismantling Racism as a Public Health Crisis. My name is Natasha Teshi-Micah, and I am a Public Policy and External Affairs Associate at the Center for Community Solutions. Today's webinar will be about what leaders in Ohio are doing to address racism as a public health crisis after they either made a decision to make a declaration or acknowledge it as a problem. If you have any questions at all after the webinar, feel free to contact me by this email address. Next slide, please. For those of you who have not heard about the Center for Community Solutions, we are a nonprofit think tank that aims to improve health, social, and economic conditions through non-bipartisan research, policy analysis, communications, and advocacy. And we have 5 priorities in which we do that, from older adults to improving the health and safety services net, infant and maternal health, behavioral health, and supporting sound Medicaid policy. To learn more about our priorities and what we do, you can follow us at communitysolutions.com and also on Twitter at CommunitySouls. Next slide, please. This is the agenda for today's program. So we will go over some housekeeping rules, followed by some stuff we are going on in our organization when it comes to the fact sheets and our blog series for this topic today. And then we'll pass it over to Zalma, who will talk about what we are doing here at CCS for racial equity. And then I will introduce our guest panelists for today, and then they will each present about this topic and what they are doing with their organization or career. And then we'll have a facilitated conversation, which is moderated by me, followed by Tanisha, who will ask questions from the Q&A box and the chat box that you all may have. And then we will close. Next slide, please. So slides in the recording will be available soon on our website. We will also have a toolkit in regards to racism as a public health crisis next month. Pretty much some information about stats and what you can do in regards to this topic. So be on the lookout for that. Microphones are muted during the webinar. And please use the Q&A box or chat box to ask questions. And all questions will be answered during the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have Twitter, feel free to tweet about this event at hashtag RAPHC webinar 2023 at Community Souls. Next slide. Earlier this week, we have released some fact sheets that you all can look at. They are the House Senate and the House Representatives fact sheets that you all can use when you advocate for any issues concerning health and human services. So feel free to click on that link and look up the fact sheets. And when you scroll down on that page, there is actually a link where you can sign up for another webinar in which we describe the fact sheets in more details. Next slide, please. And there are many ways in which organizations have defined racism as a public health crisis. we at Community Solutions define racism as a public health crisis, as how racism, especially systemic and interpersonal racism, places barriers on people of color from achieving the highest, healthiest versions of themselves. To show how systemic and interpersonal racism um, place barriers on people of color, our organization have created a blog series on how racism as a public health crisis covers a variety of topics, such as behavioral health, gun violence, infant maternal health, and more. So to learn more about this series, you can check out the link on the slide, and you can learn more about it. Next slide, please. And now I will pass it over to Zalma, who is our Senior Fellow of Community and Racial Equity, and she will describe how we at CCS are internally applying a racial equity lens to our work culture. Zalma?
Good morning, buenos dias. So in 2020, this country had to face itself in the image of a man of authority with his knee on a man's neck who begged for release in order to breathe and live. Cleveland is now without its own stories of an imbalance of power and inequities. However, Cleveland is also home of courageous leadership, historical movements, and we declare racism as a public health crisis, charging ourselves to lead change. The Center for Community Solutions, already committed to addressing disparities and gaps in policies to support our health and human services sector, joined this movement. The CCS team launched a series of blogs addressing racism as a public health crisis, and tons of readers and leaders have reached out to thank us for leading such initiative. We established a racial equity fund and the role I serve in to strategically engage and serve community. March 28, for instance, we will host a dialogue with local Black leadership of some of our historical settlement houses so that we can learn and elevate their impactful service to our neighborhood and county. Finally, we have accepted the challenge to deep dive into a journey of racial equity and inclusion by placing our own stories of self to the test. The journey thus far has challenged us, but I am proud to say it would only strengthen our commitment to serve as agents for equity and justice. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's dialogue.
Thank you, Zalma. Can you please go to the next slide? All right, so today we have 4 incredible guest panelists. So first, we have Walter Patton, who is a creator of Ghetto Therapy, a program that is free and open to the public. Ghetto Therapy offers therapy sessions that utilize all forms of therapy to heal residents from redline and impoverished communities, from generations of trauma, from Reiki, traditional sound bowl, art therapy, detox, yoga, and meditation. In 2022, his organization was awarded the Ennisfield Wolf Memorial Award. Next, we have Habeebah Grimes. She has made serving Northeast Ohio's most vulnerable children her life's work. She is sought after public speaker, community leader, and creator of No Crystal Star podcast. As CEO of Positive Education Program, also known as PEP, Habeebah leads a staff of 450 professionals committed to supporting healing in children who have experienced significant adversity and mental health challenges. Now, then we have Jenice Contreras, who is an established leader in small business and community economic development, who currently serves as the executive director of the Northeast Ohio Hispanic Center for Economic Development, and is a member of the Center for Community Solutions Board of Directors. In 2021, Jenice was recognized with the Smart 50 and Progressive Woman of the Year Awards by Smart Business Magazine and is an advocate in addressing racial diversity and representation of people of color. Finally, we have Janine Boyd. She is a pediatric speech and language pathologist, turned advocate, and state legislator. With almost 2 decades of experience in health and human services advocacy and policy as a government affairs professional, Boyd has been actively involved in Ohio's state budget process and identifying federal opportunities on behalf of programs that serve the most vulnerable citizens. She currently serves as councilwoman for the city of Cleveland Heights. Next slide, please. And now I will hand it over to Walter to talk about his organization and work. Walter?
Hey, how everybody doing today? All right, I'm Walter Patton, resident of the Central Community, 35 years. I'm 35 years old. As you know, she mentioned that I am the creator of Ghetto Therapy. That's a free and open to the public space therapy session. Today, when I think of defining and dismantling racism as a public health crisis, I think of my story starting back to 2005. I was a senior in high school. I had my first child at 17 years old. And I was going to East Tech, and I had a best friend by the name of Leonard Pinson. So Leonard Pinson was this good kid. When something happens to someone, we always want to bring up the good stories and not talk about the things that they've done to put them in situations. But in this case, he was actually a good kid. He played basketball for East Tech, and he was one of my closest friends and also my daughter's godfather. So on this specific day on January 16 in 2005, my daughter was born 10 days prior to that. Leonard Pinson, he calls me on January 16th and he says, "Walt, I want to go to this party." And in the Central Community, these housing projects feud. There's different housing projects, but we all feud with one another, like different fights, different shootouts. It's very crazy inside of the Central Community at times. So when he called me and he told me this, being from the Garden Valley projects, the public housing, that they were going to go into Alfway, which was closer to the King Kennedy public housing, who they were feuding with. So I told him, I said, "I don't think that's a good idea." I was at home babysitting my daughter, of course. And he was like, "No, I'm going to go. It's this girl that he likes there. He want to take her some balloons for her birthday party." I said, "Fine." Come 7 or 8 o'clock, I get a phone call from one of my peers telling me that Leonard Pinson was shot. And I kind of felt that something was going to happen because they were in the territory of their rival neighborhoods. But him as being this basketball player, I thought nobody would bother him. But these guys from the King Kennedy projects come to that party and have a shootout and shoot Leonard. So I get the phone call. I tell my mom, she's crying. I pick up my daughter. We take her back to her mom's house and we head to the hospital. When we get to the hospital, the entire Garden Valley projects from the public housing is inside of this hospital and everybody is crying. And an hour into my visit there, the doctor comes out and said that Leonard Pinson was dead. He was shot in the head twice and maybe once in the chest. And this was a crazy time because at 17 years old, I have become accustomed to dealing with friends dying at that age. So I was kind of numb, but in high school, it was a big thing. They had the obituary all on his locker. Everybody was there. And I had made a promise to myself that I would take myself away from all gang activity and get out of it, right? And there was a certain activist at this time that said, he was talking about it was our fault. Like, it was because of the music we listened to. It was because of the weed we was smoking. It was just our attitudes and everything that we were doing. But we were grieving, so I didn't get anything out of this. And I was looking to him for guidance at the time, but I didn't get anything out of it. So I always made a promise to myself that when I ever got in position to talk to youth or teens that's affected by gun violence, I was going to do the research on why our community inside of Central was the way it was, and why are the communities in the suburban areas are not the way ours is. Like, why there's less violence in suburban communities and more violence in the inner city. I wanted to know that because I was losing friends rapidly at 17. I lost 3 friends at the age of 17 to gun violence. So I wanted to do the research on why our communities were so violent and not the suburban communities. And the first thing I found was something called redlining. And redlining was like identifying communities of poverty, communities that had these social determinants of health inside of communities. And I wanted to know what caused redlining. So I did some more research and I found something called the Public Works Administration. And the Public Works Administration was Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 creating this legislation taking the business and home loans from banks from African Americans and giving to the white Americans, pushing them up into suburban communities, leaving us inside of impoverished communities with a lack of resources. And my great grandmother used to always talk about redlining when I was younger, but she didn't know the name for it. She talked about how living in a central community, that they lost community gardens, they lost mom and pop stores, they lost factory jobs once this legislation was passed. And she talked about how great it was. Then I read the Langston Hughes autobiography, and he talks about it because he went to Central Middle School, the same middle school that I went to. And he talked about how he had Polish and Irish friends, but when the Public Works Administration was passed, he lost those friends, and those friends moved up into suburban communities. So today, some would ask me, like, Walter, that was in 1933 when Franklin D. Roosevelt created that. How is it relevant to this day? And it brings me to the story of this kid in my youth program named James. Now, James stayed directly next door to me in a central community on Kennard in Carver Park. And one day I was pulling up to the house inside of the public housing projects, and these elders and a couple people my age in the 30s said, Walter, can you talk to James, because he's only nice around you, but he's terrorizing the community. Now, James is like 4'11". I can't understand how a 12-year-old is terrorizing the community. So I asked him, and I said, James, why everybody keep telling me that you're terrorizing the community? And he kind of laughed at me, because that's the relationship we have. And he said, Walter, he said, it's the community I live in. He didn't say it that way, but he was like, it's the hood. Like, this is where I stay. And I couldn't think of nothing but the Public Works Administration and redlining, because directly across the street from me and James, there's a vacant grocery store, Dave's on East 40th, that's been vacant the last 4 years. In 2020, I lost 3 friends to hypertension, kidney failure, and heart disease due to the structured way that we eat. Even myself, as a type 2 diabetic, with no access to fresh produce, no access to fresh meat, we're forced to shop at Rally's, Burger King, gas stations, Dollar Generals. This is where we're forced to stay due to the structured environment of us not having a grocery store. Then directly next door to me and James, there's a young lady who comes out in 2021, screaming and hollering. So the entire community comes out 6, 7 in the morning. We want to see what's wrong. Some of us are being nosy, but ultimately we want to see what's wrong with our neighbor. So as we come out, she's screaming and crying, and she said her baby is not waking up. Her baby is not waking up. So come to find out, the baby had died from SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. And SIDS happen for various reasons, but in our community, it happens from poor dieting and stressful environment. So if you have a food desert in this environment, which causes poor dieting and just a stressful, violent environment. So we have a food desert and a very high infant mortality rate. In 2018, we had a 22% infant mortality rate inside of the central community. There's a study in Place Matters that says that the average resident in Lyndhurst lives 24 years more than us in Central and in the Huff community due to our structured living conditions. And it's all the red line Public Works Administration communities. These are the communities that was affected by Public Works Administration. Then final is James lives in this community directly next to me, and there's one high school in this community, and there's 3 schools, middle schools and elementary. So there's 4 schools total. But surrounding these 4 schools and this one high school is 8 prison-based facilities. You have the 90th Justice Center, juvenile. You have the downtown Justice Center, adults. You have the 3rd and 4th district. These are all 5 to 10 minutes around this one high school driving. You have the 3rd and 4th district. Then you have the 34th and 54th halfway house with returning prisoners. Then you have the CMHA headquarters. And then directly across from the 34th halfway house, you have the women's prison. That's directly in the central community or surrounding the central community, 5 to 10 minutes away from driving. So James was always getting suspended. And I asked his mom one time, I said, why do James continue to get suspended? And his mom said, well, Walt, James cannot read. So every time he's called upon to read, he's throwing paper, slapping kids in the head to take the attention off the fact that he can't read. There's a study by a lady named Toni Preckwinkle. She's an educator and a politician from Illinois that says that in public schools all across America, they are basing prison populations off our 3rd grade reading scores inside of public schools. So when I thought about it, I said, James can't read. They're basing prison populations off our 3rd grade reading scores, and we're surrounded by 8 prisons. James recently was in prison for 6 months. He just came home 2 weeks ago. So the fact that he couldn't read and he went to prison, surrounded by these 8 prisons, which there's more prisons than school in this environment, that is how I think of defining and dismantling racism as a public health crisis, because Central was directly impacted, and still to this day, we are impacted by Public Works Administration with no grocery store. We just had the St. Vincent's of Charity close down majority of the resources that we use there. One high school, no grocery store. So these things are happening every day in a Central community. And this is a very violent community. At times we had 14 homicides in 2020, 3 under the age of 14. So this is what I mean when I think of defining and dismantling racism as a public health crisis. And the reason why I created ghetto therapy was because of this Public Works Administration in these red line communities. My target is those residents who live in similar environments to Central. That's why we provide Reiki, sound bowl, traditional, meditation, yoga, all for free, because it's not until we know the problem to where we can create solutions. I always say that it's not our fault that we was put in these situations due to our financial stability, but it becomes our fault once we learn this information and choose to be destructive. So I always say that, but these are the conditions that we are living in. This is from Public Works Administration, laws and legislations that was wrote in the 1930s that still affect us to this day. Walter Patton, the creator of ghetto therapy, and that is my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter. I really appreciate everything you share with us. Next, we will have Habeebah, who will talk about her organization and her work in regards to racism as a public health crisis. Habeebah?
Thank you. So I'm just going to invite everybody to breathe for a moment. Walter, thank you for your story. Thank you for lifting up the people who are suffering. Racism is not some amorphous thing. It is a system of violence. It is taking lives. It is taking our friends and families. And I just want to hold some space for you and want to be able to carry the heaviness as I move into my comments here. I want to thank Center for Community Solutions, Natasha, Zoma, Tanisha, others who were part of creating this space. We share in our collective humanity by sharing our stories. I'm a big believer in sharing our narratives, our stories. My mother taught me about West African griots, and I am honored that the ancestors have imparted in me the capacity to use my words to convey my passions for humanity and for Black folks and brown folks who are being destroyed by systems that were designed to crush. So thank you for this space. I'm a wife and mother, daughter, sister, friend, and I am the CEO of Positive Education Program, which is best known as PEP. I share all aspects of my identity, or those that are most close to my heart, because the words that I'm going to share, the wisdom I'm going to try to convey today is the product of both lived and professional experiences. I would not be here as CEO of PEP, but for certain life experiences that ensured my desire to be proximate to people who are suffering, to children and families who are suffering, and who should be more proximate to power. PEP, to say a little bit about what we do, we're a child serving or youth serving nonprofit, and we provide special education and mental health services and supports to young people who have very complex mental health needs and developmental needs. And the mental health needs that we see in our young people, the learning needs that we see in our young people are tremendously contributed to by adversity and trauma that is occurring in their lives during development. When I think about the necessity of addressing racism as a public health crisis, I actually go back to about 2010, 2009, 2010 in my career. And actually, I have to just really take it back further. PEP was founded in 1971 in response to a request for assistance from local school districts around federal legislation that was birthed out of the civil rights movement that granted equal access to education for children with physical and mental disabilities. This kind of transformational moment in history birthed this organization in 1971. And prior to coming to work at PEP as first a one-on-one aide and then as a school psychology intern, I entered into an environment, a world, this intersection of special education and mental health. And I was witness to, in real time, the struggles that I saw my older brother go through. And I witnessed the struggles my peers had, many of whom ended up in alternative school type environments. I was witness to struggles my siblings, my younger siblings were having. And so I myself was thinking, hey, this is a place that is meeting the needs of people like me, kids like me, my siblings, my friends. And it helped propel me to commit to a career, both in school psychology and to deepen my understanding for why are so many young people in this environment Black? Why is there this prevalence, right? And we've learned about this in our professions, surely, this disproportionate representation of Black and Brown individuals in some of the worst outcomes, socially, economically, medically. And it's often talked about and treated as something mysterious. And when I stepped into the role of CEO at PEP, I was determined in 2018 that we should stop thinking about this disproportionality that we see in terms of the children that we serve, in terms of the children who are identified as what's called emotionally disturbed in public education environments, or who are involved with systems like juvenile court, Child Protective Services here in Cuyahoga County, the Department of Children and Family Services. Stop thinking about that disproportionate representation of Black and Brown youth as something accidental and be very honest about what's the root cause here. And so I felt compelled to start to dig into that. I felt like I had inherited a legacy that this transformational change organization founded on the heels of the civil rights movement should be very actively unpacking and discussing and being part of solutions around racial equity and justice for young people. So now to 2009, when PEP had begun to deeply invest in trauma-informed care practices. That was really an important and valuable investment on the part of the organization, because it was a recognition that there was something happening in the lives of young people that was contributing to their learning and their social, emotional, and relational functioning that was not just about behavior, not just about getting the right rewards and consequences for your behavior. And in that investment at PEP, one of the things that I observed is that the trauma-informed care frameworks that were most popular and nationalized and utilized in service to young people, these frameworks were not talking about racism. They were not talking about how structural, institutional, systemic, and interpersonal and internalized racism were manifesting in the lives of young people. We were thinking and talking about trauma through the lens of the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which really looks at circumstances and sets of circumstances that are largely rooted in the family, the current family or family of origin, and maybe the community. We, in the course of all these years, have started to talk about things like community violence and poverty. But to Walter's point, we aren't or weren't talking about how structural decisions, legislated decisions, routine practices, were infused and formed out of an anti-Black and white supremacist framework, and that was creating and sustaining conditions that caused children to suffer. So as PEP has taken further steps to be thinking about racial and social justice and equity, we have begun to talk about trauma as something that is inclusive of racism and racialized experiences. We can't possibly continue to talk about youth and their experiences of adversity, trauma, chronic stress, and not talk about racism. And that means that we have to interrogate our organizational practices, our institutional practices, and we have to surface those things that we might need to be addressing in the immediate so that we are not creating conditions that re-traumatize young people and further their experiences with racism and anti-Blackness. And in service to that, a couple things have happened since George Floyd's murder and the shift in the zeitgeist, so to speak, to begin to really start to talk about our lingering issues with racism and depression. So what PEP has done is first named racism as a source of trauma and adversity and begun to look at this internally through the process of an equity audit. We had our first equity audit as an organization during the pandemic. And we packaged together our strategic plan and equity work, I should say, really braided together. Equity, agility, strategy as one body of work that we moved through during the pandemic and persisted with even though the pandemic created so much organizational stress. Because it's unhelpful, it's not useful to write blog posts and make declarations and be out here talking the talk if we as an organization aren't walking the walk. So it's been essential to me that we would walk the walk as well as talk the talk, be inside the organization, looking at ourselves and being willing to be present with the discomfort at what we see when we see things that don't align with our intended and stated values and mission, and start to address the root causes that we inherit, right, as part of a system that has racism as a foundational element. We also have begun to centrally bring together the champions for equity that are inside the organization. Folks need community when we're talking about anti-racism. We need community when we're trying to move forward anti-oppressive practices as we are trying to lift up the ways that anti-Blackness or white supremacy are manifesting in the system. As we try to grow our fund of knowledge and as we try to create change. So we brought those folks together and created community for ourselves and for those in the organization, and are working through a process of creating power, right? That this central group of folks would not just be a group of trainers or DEI kind of voices in the community, but actually moving forward change and taking the time to engage with experts in the DEIB space, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, to ensure that we are accountable to what it is we're saying that we will do. The other thing that I just want to name as we're thinking about what it means to actually operationalize addressing racism as a public health crisis. I spoke earlier about the importance of kind of letting folks who are closest to the pain get close to the power. And so we have our work cut out for us in the behavioral health and mental health and education spaces. I will tell you that there is so much distress happening that is being created by the pandemic, but also the factors, the realities that Walter's talking about as young people are dying in our community, as young people are perpetrating acts upon their peers that result in loss of life or serious injury. we can lose sight of the bigger picture because we're so focused on the immediacy of safety. And so as I think about like, how do we help young people and their family members get closer to power, get closer to the levers of change, we have to do the work of self-regulation and making sure that our systems are capable of creating that space, even as there's distress, even as there's anxiety or fear and actual harm in the system. So looking to the future, you know, I would offer that for those of us who have some privilege, who have consider ourselves allies, co-conspirators, advocates, community leaders, champions for equity and justice, and specifically racial equity and justice, stay the course, stay ready, be willing to put some of your social, political, economic resources on the line. There are mutual aid needs that are significant in our community. Our nonprofit sectors are having their own work, our own work to do, because most are not kind of grassroots founded and led like ghetto therapy. And so we have our work to do internally so that we are creating the environments that we seek to create, decolonizing our mindsets and advancing progressive practices and service to our young people. So we have that work to do, and we have that all to do in an environment of significant economic and social distress. And meanwhile, folks I call the adversaries to equity, you've seen the behavior over the last several years in response to that multiracial, multi-generational, cross-socioeconomic community of people who rose up in response to George Floyd's murder, in response to what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, in response to Breonna Taylor's murder, rose up and started to demand racial justice and speak to the concerns of anti-Blackness, speak to the reality of anti-Blackness. And now we see that we are literally having ourselves legislated out of opportunities to bring awareness, to raise deeper understanding, create empathy, and close empathy gaps. So we have to stay the course in spite of the fear that's being stoked, in spite of the zero-sum perspectives that persist, in spite of the notion that only white voices matter, right? So when white parents show up to school board meetings and school policy starts to change, meanwhile, parents like myself who have 2 Black boys are worried to death about how their educational life will be experienced. My voice matters too. Our voices matter too. So staying the course is so essential right now. And I have to say, to the people of the global majority, to Black, Indigenous, folks of color, we often use that term BIPOC, we have to begin to understand how racism is sitting inside of us, the ways that white supremacy and anti-Blackness have been internalized, what's happening to our youth that is causing them not to see one another's humanity. That is part of this bigger picture. The ways that our community is just hyper infused with poor foods and poor opportunities for healthy choices, but also they proliferate with guns. We, as human beings who've experienced generations of suffering, there are vulnerabilities in our brain that make us predisposed to salty foods, crunchy foods, fatty foods, the things that aren't most healthy, that make us not able to see ourselves in the fullness and the humanity within ourselves. And this is not a death sentence. I don't want to convey that this is just all that we have for us, because just as we inherit our trauma across generations, we also inherit deep strength and resilience and beauty and power. And the human brain has certain tendencies for how it responds to suffering. The human body and brain were not designed to be under the level of stress that we and our communities have endured for 400 years and more. And so we need to understand what's happening to us, what's happening inside of us, and we need to heal. Even as we push for justice and seek justice, we have to heal and understand what we are facing. And we have to create space for our young people to have that kind of experience as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Habeebah. Mental health is very important, and we have to recognize that trauma is a form of racism. And let's all just take that into consideration as we address this issue. Next, we have Jenice Contreras, who will describe what her work is, what her organization is doing, and also she will talk about this issue from a standpoint as a board member. Jenice?
Thank you, Natasha. And all I could say is, wow, right? That was super powerful. So thank you, Habeebah and Walter and Janine for being a part of this. And I'm just honored and humbled to share space with the presenters, with the Center for Community Solutions for creating this platform for us to talk about such an important issue that touches all of our work, but beyond the work, all of our lives, right? So this is about our real work when we leave our offices or our place of work. So Jenice Contreras, CEO of the Hispanic Center for Economic Development. Obviously, there's a big H in our name, so definitely focused on lifting the Latino community in the areas of small business development and economics. And I think when we're talking about racism, we don't talk enough about economic justice and economic equity, right? And how that plays a factor into health outcomes and social determinants of health and options, right? This belief that there really isn't a scarcity of resources, right? But it's more the distribution of resources and who has access and who doesn't. And so our organization has been doing this work for nearly 50 years of really making sure that we help Latino businesses specifically navigate through complex systems that are intended to be that way intentionally. And to that, you add a language barrier or a cultural barrier or an educational gap, right? And so our goal is really to take that, to remove the barriers and really empower individuals to navigate and grow and create wealth and have thriving businesses. You know, because we're a business serving organization, we don't typically fall in that immediate need. But the reality is that a lot of micro businesses are, you know, mom and pop stores, as we call them, are really in the poverty line, right? Are low to moderate income. So that we're not talking about multi-millionaire firms, you know, just because you own a business. Oftentimes, you know, they're operating their business without a salary or sacrificing for their families to create jobs. And so really understanding the fabric of small business in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and in specific communities of color. We are the home to a small business development center, which is free services to entrepreneurs. We have the great fortune here in Cleveland of having 2 of the 3 small business development centers embedded in neighborhood organizations. So here at the Hispanic Business Center and the Urban League of Greater Cleveland are home to small business development centers. And then Cleveland State University is the 3rd. But it gives a different level of access of being able to come here, know us, and really educate. Also understanding that people turn to entrepreneurship because they have a passion, they have grit, they have a toolbox, right? They have a kitchen and they know how to cook really well. And it's just really doing and making out to support your family with whatever resources you have. And so they may have never sat through an accounting course or have never had, just again, understanding how do you access capital and what does that look like? What is your credit? And so really dismantling all of those barriers that would prevent them from having a viable business in our economic system. Beyond that, while our small business development services are available to anyone in the state of Ohio, we are housed in the Clark-Fulton neighborhood in Cleveland. The Clark-Fulton neighborhood has the largest density of Latino residents in the state of Ohio. And so I think sometimes that gets missed. For too long, the Hispanic community has been a little invisible, right? Folks don't know where they're at, how to tap into the community. And while Cleveland and Ohio and the country, is losing population, our population is growing. The Latino community is very young. We're having babies, and we're really, growing the population just about anywhere you look. And the last census data has proven that. So, we fall into this black and white conversation and really teasing out and finding and claiming our space in the conversations of racism and discrimination and social determinants of health and factors that affect our community. And so that is really important. Beyond that, I grew up in the Clark Fulton neighborhood, so I get to come to work every day right here where the magic happens for our community. And, the west side of Cleveland gets a bad reputation because of all these thriving neighborhoods around us, but we still face significant barriers. We don't have a grocery store. We have a lot of challenges around health, lead of our children, and face a lot of comorbidities that a lot of the Black community faces as well. And so we are equally suffering, but equally in this fight together to achieve equity for our communities. So again, going back to what our organization, is really empowerment through education and advocacy, and really being able to empower our community to navigate through complex systems, to be able to thrive and grow and make Northeast Ohio their home. And be able to have those opportunities. When we talk about, racism as a public health crisis, and some of the misconceptions related to that is that we are talking about an ism, right? We are talking about racism, not just race, and how that the factor of racism plays into your accessibility to just about everything, right? Healthcare, social supports, economics, education. It's all determined. A lot of the conversations that we've already had around, just systems that have been in place since the foundation of our country, right? And really racist principles that continue to oppress our communities in education and in every way. And so how do we start to dismantle that? And how do we leverage legislation to do that, right? And I think that's one of the most important things about, the legislation around racism as a public health factor, is that now this is a powerful tool for us to be able to use that and say, hey, there's legislation behind calling it out, right? Not calling it out, but then calling for action. And that's really what policy does for us, and how do we leverage policy. And the work that CCS is so important in that respect. And it's an honor for me to sit on the board, because it's one, really being able to advocate for the policy, but how do we use policy to empower communities to get to an equitable phase? And so I think that is powerful in itself. Habeebah mentioned a lot about just the dynamic between calling out the legislation, the racial fluid and racial distress in our country, this pandemic phase, and kind of creating a perfect storm for us to be able to have these conversations, regardless of your race, regardless of where you grew up, regardless of your background, right? That we can't ignore it. We can't continue to ignore racism and its implications that it has on our communities, and that we have to lead from whatever corner we're leading on creating a more just community for everyone. And so for my organization specifically, I think again, this perfect storm around the legislation and the racial tensions has given us a platform to have conversations that we didn't have before. We're getting invited to meetings we weren't invited before, right? And are able to tell our story, right? That, we've been here for a long time. I just didn't move here from Puerto Rico yesterday, but our community has been here and has been contributing to the economic fabric of the city, of the state, of this country. And so just being able to have that platform and being able to talk about it is what legislature has empowered us to do. And so tying it back to really that impact and how do we move that conversation forward? And so looking at going back to just kind of our core work in business development and the pandemic and racial distress, we're seeing folks leaving traditional work and starting businesses. You know, historically, we would see about 400 businesses a year here at the center prior to the pandemic. Now we're seeing over 1,000 clients a year, either starting a business, growing a business, dusting off a business plan that they had, right? We're looking for alternative ways to meet our community needs and kind of create local economies, right? If we can't participate in this huge systemic, capitalism, how do we start building local economies of scales in our neighborhoods, in our backyards, in our urban gardens? And so I think this is really turning to be a revolution and a movement of the small business community taking leadership and saying, okay, if I can't participate there, if I can't get that bank loan, what can I do? What can I do in my community? What can I do in my backyard? How can I feed my children? How can we tackle this issue from the ground up? And oftentimes we don't look to that. We don't look to the neighborhoods. We don't look to the people around us and look at people as assets, right? The biggest assets of this neighborhood, it's people. I have been engaged in a lot of development around the Clark Fulton to really recognize that this is an ethnic hub of Latino community, that this neighborhood is super, super diverse, and that it hasn't been honored, right? The neighborhood hasn't seen the investment that other neighborhoods have had. People don't talk about this neighborhood being Latino. I have no clue who Clark or Fulton were. I'm sure they were great guys, but Clark Fulton says nothing about the people and the color and the food and the dynamic and the fabric of a neighborhood. And so how do we shift that? How do we shift that so that we could be celebrated and elevate the residents of this neighborhood, the small businesses in this neighborhood that are making it happen? And how does it make economic sense, right? That it's not just about a feel good. It's not just about a little nonprofit. It's about economics, and it's about upward mobility of a people. And so we have been directly engaged in that work. Gosh, nearly a decade directly myself here as executive director. I get to celebrate a decade of work. But within that, something as simple as just having space and creating spaces for people, exactly what Walter is doing, right? Creating space in the central neighborhood. We are doing the same thing here in the Clark Fulton neighborhood. There is no one place that you could go. And so we have embarked in a project called Centro Villa 25, so center of the Hispanic village on West 25th. Our organization purchased 2 acres of land on West 25th, which we purchased it a few years ago, but right now we're sitting on a landmine, being that there's just a lot of upward mobility in the Clark Fulton neighborhood, but then more importantly, that it belongs to the community, right? We don't have a fancy developer that's coming to Clark Fulton to tell us what we need in this neighborhood. We are figuring that out in our own. And so our organization serves as project owner and developer of our own project, right? Centro Villa is intended to create small business opportunities, so small business kiosks that are affordable to business owners so they could start. You know, this neighborhood is saturated with fast food, dollar stores, auto parts, with very little opportunity for someone to conceive their dream of having a business. And so under one roof, we will be able to have 20 businesses along with a commercial kitchen. We love, people talk about love languages. In a lot of communities of color, our love language is food, right? We love to feed people, but it's also an economic opportunity. So we're putting a commercial kitchen because folks in our community don't have access to commissary kitchens or expensive systems that we just, again, can't access. So we're building a commercial kitchen so that our Latina ladies can make their tamales, their pasteles, their sofrito, all of it, and use it as an economic engine, right? You're doing it with the permits, with the certifications, with all of the requirements that you could really grow your business and not have the liability of making products and selling them in your home, right? So this is really how we're creating local economies of scale to really combat all of the issues of our social determinants of health and improving the outcomes of our communities. So it doesn't come without a cost, right? For 10 years, I've been raising money. $12 million is the cost of this project. But happy to say that we're close to closing that. We'll be breaking ground this summer. And I invite all of you guys to participate in Centro Villa in next summer, right? So next summer, Centro Villa will be open. But really, again, just really coming up with our own solutions, leveraging legislation, leveraging our leadership, diversifying the leadership and the folks that are representing us in every level matters, right? Encouraging, if it's not your calling, supporting the people that are called to serve that look like us. Unfortunately, it's a very lonely place there. But how can we support to have more folks representing us and taking on the oath of public service? Because we need those voices and we need that empowerment. And, for way too long, the Latino community doesn't have anybody at the table, right? Or hasn't had them, and now, we have one councilwoman who does phenomenal work, right? But how do we lift the individuals that take on this work? How do we lift Janine? How do we lift all of our elected officials? And how do we keep them true to the work and to the communities that they're in and representing that? And that does not happen in
Jenice, you're on mute. You're on mute. I cannot hear you. No, we still cannot hear you. Please give us one moment as we try to figure this out. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay. Maybe that was my cue that my time was up because I lost track of time. But my apologies for that interruption. But leading boldly, not giving up, finding strength within each other, creating spaces like this for us to come together and be able to talk about our struggles, our challenges, the stories, the people. Walter, thank you for honoring the folks that oftentimes are forgotten or not represented or get a bad rap for whatever. I think that is our role and our job to lift all together and continue this work. So thank you again. It's been a true honor and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jenice. Now we'll pass it over to Councilwoman Boyd, who will talk about what she has done in regards to policy on a state level in regards to racism as a public health crisis.
Hey, everyone. So I have a 3-year-old, full disclosure. He's walking this way right now. I apologize. This is, we still have a little bit of pandemic life going on in here. So I apologize. He's not quite in preschool. And let me say too, like everyone before me, thank you so much to the Center for Community Solutions, Natasha, John, everyone there, who I adore and have for many years. And the work that you do to help us do good work in policy and standing with us throughout the whole process, from committee process. No, come on, remember, you really get your big surprise. I have a surprise for you. Listen, okay, I'm sorry. So I want to thank you all for this opportunity too. And I don't know how to follow these 3 people that you all put me last after is just unreal. Walter, Habeebah, Jenice, my goodness, thank you for all that you all do. And the spirit that lives in you. Hey, remember you made a promise to mommy. So, sorry guys, he's been quiet this entire time. So, let me talk about policy. Give me 1 minute. I'm so sorry. Okay, so as many of you know, I am back in public policy on City Council in Cleveland Heights. This is where I started. Before that, though, I had the incredible opportunity of serving formerly House District 9 in the state legislature. And while I was there for 7.5 years, we introduced back in June 2020 a resolution declaring racism a public health crisis and asking the governor to create a working group that would focus on addressing inequity across the state and create opportunities for equity in the state. And what that meant to us was that we would start having these really difficult conversations with our members, our colleagues who have been insulated from having to have the conversation, insulated by their own particular race, socioeconomic status, educational level, where they live, interest or desire to have the conversation. They've been insulated for whatever reasons, and some even intentional about not having those conversations for whatever their reasons. And it meant for us too that we would begin doing additional things in participation with that resolution. For instance, within 6 months of the resolution being introduced, we created the first Black Maternal Health Caucus. No thank you. Shh, no thank you. The first Black Maternal Health Caucus. And from that, legislation began being introduced that addressed specifically at-risk pregnancies of Black and brown women. We introduced legislation around creating or requiring health equity dashboards, by our medical firms, which would be amazing. We have not passed that. That has not been passed. I should not say we anymore. But it really started some things that continue now. Okay, I hear y'all. They want to say hi. Say hi.
Hi. I'm Robbie.
He said, I'm Robbie, y'all.
This is Mommy.
And this is Mommy.
This is Habeebah. What is
See the hearts you're
Mommy?
getting?
Yep.
All right, can you do me a favor though, for real? Can you go play when Mommy finishes this, please? And
It's
then
so long.
I know it's long, but then
Can
guess
I
what?
help you?
You can help me by going to play with your toys, and then guess what's going to happen? I have that really fun surprise for you. So just give me this time, and then we're going to do that really fun surprise. It's a big surprise. You're going to be so excited. All right? Can you do it? I know you can do it. I know you can do it. You got this. I know you got this. Okay, so we understand, all of us here, right? That's why we're here. That racism is both interpersonal and structural, right? We've all talked about this. Habeebah, when you said, created to crush systems, the way the systems have been created to crush, it's just really was such a powerful statement to me. And all the research Walter did and spoke of to understand redlining and how, that impacted all of us and continues to. It goes to the structural, right? The structural part that racism plays. It's, if you remember about the resolution, it was introduced in the Senate first by my sister, former Senator Sandra Williams, and my brother, Senator Herschel Craig. That was back in June 2020. And if you recall the news that came out of that hearing, we only had one now. We only had one hearing in the Senate. We didn't get any in the House. In the House, it was introduced as a partner piece by my sister, former Rep. House, and my sister, former Rep. Crawley. We didn't get any hearings in the House, but we got one hearing in the Senate, and it was deep. Do you all remember the news that came out after that hearing? When the vice chair of the Senate Committee on Health, who also happened to be a trained emergency room physician, asked the question, and listen, I wrote it down because I wanted to make sure I quoted him accurately for you all today. But he asked the question, the person testifying at that time was the executive director of the Ohio Commission on Minority Health. It was a Black woman. She was a brilliant Black woman, been around a lot of governors and knows her thing, knows her work. And he asked, this was related to her conversation around her testimony around COVID and the health disparities around COVID. Because remember now, this was 2020. And he asked the question, you know, could it be that the reason for the disparities in the COVID numbers is really because Black people and colored people, he said this, the African-American population or colored people, that's what he said, don't wash their hands as well or wear masks or social distance. Could that be the reason for the disparities? He asked that. Live streamed on the Ohio channel, a trained emergency room physician, a relative to, you know, like biologically related to now the Senate president, vice chair of the committee. You understand and then who later became the chair of the committee on health. And he asked that of the executive director on the Commission on Minority Health. Almost. I know, but you're doing great. So I think that what they didn't intend to happen did happen. You know, after that resolution, after that hearing, really, you saw roughly 27, 28 communities across the state introduce resolutions of their own, declaring racism a public health crisis. We, the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus at that time, had an incredible call with the, I know, thank you, with the governor. Now that call was deep. My mother always taught me about telling stories. Telling stories is the way. I love telling stories. This call with the governor was incredible. No, thank you. So, no, thank you. Hey, sit down. So the governor, we had this call with him about the resolution. We wanted his support. So we were asking him to be public about his support for the resolution. We kind of got there. But what was incredible was one of my colleagues who's in the Senate now, she said, Governor, it's, you know, because he had a hard time saying it. You know, come on, this, you know, to talk about racism, if you have not been on the receiving end, requires a lot of self-reflection, an honest depth of honesty that is difficult. It's hard. It's hard to talk about. It's hard to talk about. That's why my colleagues never wanted to talk about it. You know, because you have to look at the policy you write. How does that continue the legacy that racism has in our structures and in our systems? How does your policy, you know, promote continuation of it, expand it even, you know, into places we didn't think about it, you know, even make it real in other places where we had kept sacred, right? So that requires a lot of courage, a lot of, if you got a 3-year-old, that would help, but you know, not everybody does. It's a little like mine, especially that keeps it real. So
my friend Robbie. Hey, this is Robbie. This is my friend
So sorry.
Robbie.
This is
And
hilarious.
this is
There
my
was not a
twin,
poop
Mommy.
from the other room before this. So the governor, so he danced around a little bit. No, you may not touch that,
I
please.
just touched.
No, thank you.
I just
But
touched.
I want you not to touch it. Can you
it.
listen?
Oh.
No,
oh.
thank you.
Oh.
Please, thank you. So the governor, who was struggling in the conversation
Mom,
and sort of
stop,
avoiding
stop.
the
I
word
heard
racism.
something. I heard
My
ringing.
colleague, my colleague,
Look, your
listen, I gotta
phone
tell the
is
story.
ringing.
It's not. Let me
Yeah,
tell the story.
I
Let me
hear
tell
ya.
the story. Listen to the story.
Yeah,
Listen.
beeping noise.
Okay, but listen, let mommy tell the story. Listen to the story. It's about the governor. Listen, you ready? So we were on this call with the governor, and my friend in the Senate, she said, Governor, it's like if you have a friend who is an alcoholic, who struggles with alcoholism. And you know, when you struggle with alcoholism, sometimes the first, you know, really what the first, listen to the story, The first step is to acknowledge that you have a problem. To say that you have a problem. And you know what the governor, y'all, do you know what the governor said?
Yeah.
He sighed, and then he said,
No, it don't.
you know, I have
something.
I know someone. He said, I know someone.
I know someone.
He said, I know someone. And that is exactly what they had to do first. They had to say they had a problem. They had to say it first. And he said, I understand. I support it. Racism is a public health crisis. He said it on the phone call. I'll never forget it. I even sent him a text later to say thank you. And I have not thanked him for a lot of things. Anyway, I don't mean to get into all that. I would say this to you all in terms of policy, because everybody else is really, they're all doing, I mean, the people that I have to follow with my child here, which is probably what we all needed, because it's hard to hear all this and talk about this. And it's painful. And I'm raising this little boy, and he's Black, and it's terrifying some days. So this is all heavy, and it's hard. And you see, he's very headstrong. So Lord have mercy, the calls I'll likely get from teachers. I'm preparing in prayer now. But I would just say to you all that keep doing the program, but hold your legislators accountable. If you don't hear anything else coming out of the Black Maternal Health Caucus, or you don't hear anything else coming out of, the caucus that you support, call them and tell them that they need to revisit those policies. We didn't ever get a hearing, like I said, in the House for the resolution. I do. You found it. That's where we put the batteries. Good job.
You know batteries inside it.
I know. I will put some in after, I promise. So call them and say, whatever happened to the resolution on declaring the racism as a public health crisis? Can you all reintroduce that? Can you all keep pushing? Because that's all democracy is. That's all it is. You just keep pushing. You can't stop. I mean, if you stop, then you see what happens when we stop. Who was the previous, and who was in the White House before? If we don't stop, democracy falls. If we stop. So you can't stop. Everything that our ancestors fought for, we have to continue to fight for. There is no final victory dance. You just have to keep doing it. So hold your legislators accountable. Be supportive. I appreciate what Jenice said so much, because it is hard out here when you really care and you're trying to do right. It's not easy, and especially given that you understand democracy does take time. Good balanced policy takes time, because you have to build consensus, you have to hear from people, you have to put their input in the policy where you can, and then you have to bring it forth, and then you have to deal with the people that never wanted you to bring it forth. Right? So it takes time to deliver
Look.
balanced,
Mommy,
helping
mommy,
policy that
excuse
helps.
me,
Yes,
excuse
baby.
me.
Yes, baby.
Look.
Okay,
is
we're
this
gonna.
all
I'm
Daddy
gonna
wants?
I'm gonna free you all from this, and I'm gonna hug and kiss this baby who did his very best, and I appreciate you all. You don't know what this opportunity means to me.
Share me, mommy.
Mhm. Thank you, Councilwoman Boyd. We appreciate all the work you have been doing in the public policy space. And your son, I'm sure he's trying to help out with the webinar too. All right, so we are gonna go to the moderation. I'm just gonna ask 1 or 2 questions to the panelists, and then feel free to ask any questions in the chat or the Q&A box, and Tanisha will read them to our panelists. One of the questions I have for you all is, since racism as a public health crisis has been declared or acknowledged, name, if any, some successes you have seen in your organizational work. I know that some of you mentioned some of the successes, but if you can explain others, that would be great.
Is it like a specific order?
No order.
So you said name a success that like the programs that we're running having?
Yes.
So I could start. I think with ghetto therapy is 2 months ago, we recently landed a partnership with Langston Hughes facility in Cleveland Clinic. That first night, we got over 101 residents to attend a therapy session. And what's happening is it's getting bigger week in, week out. This is every week, and we have no less than 50 residents every week. So the success that we're having is the turnout to receive these free therapy services is big for us because, I mean, the stigma is that a lot of the times that I hear is that Blacks don't go to therapy, when in reality we do. And a lot of the times we don't know these resources exist. So to bring Black therapists inside of Black communities that look like us, live like us, is a very important thing. And to see 100 people as the turnout is a success to receive free therapy services of all kinds. I only expected 10 or 15 people to come, but it's getting bigger. So that's a success to me, is the turnout that these therapy sessions are having.
That's awesome. Anyone else would like to tackle this question?
A couple things I just would lift up is creating space for dialogue in my organization, which is predominantly white in terms of the staff, the professionals, and predominantly Black in terms of who's being served. And so addressing the need to have these conversations has been a victory. And folks who are champions for equity and justice having access to conversations that I'm facilitating, that a consultant that's working with us, that has been a victory. And these feel like small victories, but we have to start with conversation where folks can be with the discomfort before we can take additional action that is race conscious, right? And informed by the experience of racial trauma that our youth have experienced, and the structural and systemic problems that create the needs that our young people present with. So that, I call that a victory. The space for conversation, the connection to folks who are doing this work in their corner of the organization, like amplifying that, creating a point of learning for that, that's also essential. And then the other thing that I feel proud of at PEP is our leaders in 2019 went to the Racial Equity Institute at Third Space Action Lab and spent 2 days, right? Not just the groundwater. Let me tell y'all, groundwater ain't it's part of the picture. Get to phase 1 training, because that is where you start to understand the intentionality and the design and the codification of racism into our everyday lives in every sector: education, health, food justice, environmental justice, you learn about the injustice in it all. And that was so awakening for leaders at PEP. And that's essential, that we all come to this with a shared fund of knowledge about why this is important work, and not treat, again, the realities that Black and Brown youth are experiencing as like some, wow, you know, can you believe these disparities? Wow, no, these are intentional outcomes of institutional structural systemic design.
Yes, and training and also just being uncomfortable to talk about it. You have to be uncomfortable to actually feel comfortable to talk about it and make resolutions and make an impact in this issue. So thank you so much, Habeebah. Another question I have for you all, anyone can answer this question, is, in your opinion, how will racism as a public health crisis look like in the future? What do you think will be the future challenges of addressing this issue?
I almost want Janine to answer this one, because it's a big one for me. And we can hear from Baby Boy again too. I'm not mad at that. That was so beautiful to witness, that love and care. But a big one for me is just the legality of it, right? I'm a school psychologist. I am independently licensed in the state of Ohio. And I'm out here talking about racism and the systemic effects. And there are folks legislating that I could lose my licensure for talking about it, training and speaking to it. That kind of legislation in Ohio would have a very stunting and undermining impact. And some of us are going to have to put our lives and livelihoods on the line even more if we continue the work. So that is something that I see as a huge potential barrier.
Can you repeat that question?
Yes. So in your opinion, how will racism as a public health crisis look like in the future? What do you think will be the future challenges of addressing this issue?
Okay, Jenny, you can go. I know you was going. I just wanted to hear the question again.
Okay, Walter, you sure you want to say something in response?
No, I can go. No, I can go after you.
Okay, honey,
Mom,
thank
I
you. Well, look,
finished
go ahead,
this
child,
one.
because this boy just started talking. Go ahead.
Mom,
So what I was thinking is, I kind of lost my train of thought, but when I'm talking about redlining the Public Works Administration, and a lot of times when I talk about it, organizations is in the room, they kind of look at it as a recycled conversation, and they say, well, Walter, this conversation goes on and nothing is done about it, right? And it's like, well, it is recycled. To be honest, it is a recycled conversation, but only amongst organizations who get financial gain from creating presentations off of this and selling it into other organizations. But when I'm inside of schools like Ted Ginn and John Adams, the communities that's impacted by redlining the Public Works Administration, only one student out of 200 students I talked to ever heard of it. So what I'm trying to say is that how they're going to react to this soon of structured racism, and once they, because now they're being exposed to it and they know the laws and the legislations, they can go back and identify when it was created and who created it. What you're going to see soon in my environment, because I always speak to my experience, is violence. You're going to see more violence inside of these communities towards structured racism. The enemy will be changed versus from ourselves to the ones who created these laws and legislations. And that's what you're going to see soon. And I don't recommend it. That's why I always try to keep these therapy services available so we can, tap into our mental and not go that route. But what you're going to see is these younger generations become very angry at systems because they're now just learning this. So when I'm talking about it, it's coming from an educating perspective and never a complaining perspective, because my communities don't know about this. And once they find out, like they're finding out now, those students at Ted Ginn and John Adams was upset. And they started to, say racist things. And I had to tell them, like, no, this is what ghetto therapy combat. Come to the therapy sessions and learn mentally how to go at it from a legal perspective. So in my opinion, I think that we will see some violence towards authorities that's creating these laws.
So The only thing I would add is I don't think it's what Walter is describing is going to be unique to any particular community. Look what happened January 6th, right? So there is definitely a palpable opposition to talking about racism and how it has provided so much gain to so many at the demise of so many others, or destruction of so many others, you know, or attempted destruction of so many others. And I think that what is also important moving forward is that we look, we all, whether you're an advocate or a program director or whatever policymaker, whatever you do, you have to try to train yourself to read between the lines, right? I think that people who have been on the receiving end of racism or bigotry have a master's degree in reading between the lines, because so many, I mean, that's where the term microaggressions comes from, right? Is being able to read between the lines. That's all it is. When somebody says something to you knowing what they really meant, you know, that's reading between the lines. So you have to do that with policy. You know, so when, like I was at a meeting last night, and we were talking about the policy, the bills that are being introduced, Senate Bill 1, the PAC bill, and House Bill 1, which deals with property taxes, and still hurts the libraries and the schools and local governments. I mean, who is that intended to hurt? Who is that intended to hurt? Who's being educated in public schools? You know, who goes to the library for free internet access and to get books that they might not otherwise be able to get? Who does all that? You know, in our cities primarily. And the thing that I learned early on as a legislator, and my mother taught me this too when she was a legislator, and it was profound to me. My mother helped write TANF reform, or welfare reform, TANF. And so she toured all 88 counties. I went with her to several of them, and I was like, I don't want to keep doing this. This is deep. But I went with her on some of the tour. And what I found, and it continues to this day, and it's profound, is that people who are not Black and brown, when they think of poverty, they might think of Appalachia. They might think of people who look like them to a degree. But when they think of programs that help people in poverty, they do not think of people who look like them. They only think about people who look like me. Mom, and the panelists. Mom, not almost. So they understand that poverty is everywhere, potentially. Maybe. I mean, that might be too strong, because when I was writing Aisha's Law, I went to a particular person to co-sponsor with me at first, I asked her if she'd be interested in joint sponsoring, and she said, oh, well, I'm flattered and blah, 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 but that domestic violence doesn't happen in my district. Like, she actually said that out loud to me. So maybe there are people who probably don't think that poverty is anywhere near them. But I am telling you all that there is a distinction in their minds between programs, you know, what people have called safety net programs, and who those help, and who is poor, and what poverty proliferates, right? Where there is increased poverty, likely there is increased crime. So, because there is increased desperation and other dynamics. So I think you all need to read between the lines, and when you see policy that's being introduced, you think about who it's going to adversely impact the most. And then you pursue advocacy without ceasing to counter, to replace, or to stop altogether. That would be what my thoughts are about the future of the resolution, and also any other conversation around racism. But people are mad about it. They don't want to talk about it. So okay, bye y'all.
Natasha, I know we're against time, but I was just gonna say, I had a conversation a few weeks ago with my Latina sister Sulma, and we were talking about a lot of issues around policy and how this whole idea of we're nonpartisan, right? Sometimes there are issues and topics that are leaning one way or another. And so I think we're gonna have to change. This idea is, hey, I vote on issues or I vote on this because something's lean one way or another. And I think racism is one of those, and racist legislature is one of those. And so I think we're going to have to be really vigilant, but we're also going to have to take a stance on things that probably in the past we didn't, because they lean to a party or lean one way or another. And so I see that shifting in the near future for us.
Thank you so much. So we only have 1 minute left. So I'm gonna have Tanisha ask one question from the audience and to have our panelists give the answer. I'm gonna try to see if I can gather the questions, and then hopefully they will be able to answer it in type format, and then we can send it out to you all once we send you all a follow-up email about this presentation. All right, so Tanisha, do we have any questions in the chat box or QA?
Yes, I'm going to try to combine 2 of them so we can get a 2 for 1. While I ask the question, if the panelists can share their contact information in the chat, there were a couple people who wanted to contact some of you all. So the question I thought might be helpful to pose is, someone wanted to know what is the most effective way to address the unconscious racism or prejudice that some white individuals have when it comes to racism? And what does it mean to decolonize our mindset?
I'm happy to say a few words about this. And that is, something that comes to mind for me. And I'm learning so much, quite honestly, from Native American women, specifically in my own life, who are modeling the way for what it looks like to make demands for decolonization, but also to kind of embody and live and practice in a decolonizing way. And so for me, it's like ceding power, access, resources to folks who had those opportunities and that access and those necessary resources withdrawn, stolen, displaced, pulled away, divested, really ceding to those individuals, those things that have been displaced, and that includes land, right? And it also means valuing, celebrating, uplifting folks whose culture, whose racial, ethnic, cultural identities have been criminalized, marginalized, treated as less than, bottom of the pile kinds of ways of being, really elevating and centering those ways of being, that cultural wisdom, that ancestral wisdom, elevating that and allowing us to let that be elevated as we move through the world, showing up authentically and not having ourselves diminished by notions of white supremacy.
Thank you, Habeebah. Does anyone else? Oh, Walter, I see you off of mute. Go ahead.
That was a layered question. Can you kind of repeat that one more time?
Sure. So it's combining 2 questions, but 2 of our individuals who are here today wanted to know, how can white individuals address unconscious bias and prejudice, and how can they decolonize their mindset, as Habeebah was saying earlier?
I guess it's several ways, but in my opinion, it's just to how can I say this? Get involved, I would say, like with these programs that we have, like Habeebah, the things that I have going on, and other people just, show up and participate. Like I say, even the things that I have to offer, I never say that no particular race isn't involved or invited. So my thing would just get involved and just show that, that you care. At some point, it's kind of like when the police brutality thing happens and you have like white rappers and they don't say anything about it, and it's like, well, I think silence is silence is kind of like agreement in my opinion. So just getting involved and speaking out on issues that's right. It doesn't have anything to do with race. I think right is right and wrong is wrong. Yeah, I don't see it. I mean, just get involved. That's my thing. And I had to have a hard stop at 1. I have another Zoom. So thank y'all for today. I look forward to contacting, and anybody contacting me, I'll see y'all sometime soon. And feel free to invite me to another panel anytime.
Thank you for coming, Walter.
No problem. So yeah, just get involved.
Yes,
Does
thank you so
anyone
much.
else? I'm sorry. Does anyone else want to answer the question?
That's a deep question. I don't know. The only thing I can tell you is everything, my mother used to tell me that every conversation was a learning opportunity and a teaching opportunity. So you learn something when you listen to people. So the first step I would say is you listen. As hard as it is, sometimes it's very hard to listen. People say the most outrageous things sometimes, and especially in bodies of government. I'll just say it that way. But once you listen, then you can understand some core things, and you can, when it's your turn, you can say something that they also take away with them. And it may not be the same way you take away what they say, but it's just, you have to chip away at stuff. That, again, we are in this democracy, right? And so every form of government has people with ideas. It's about whether or not those ideas are ever considered, right? In a democracy, they're supposed to be considered. But when we talk about racism and how it impacts structures and systems, in order for other people's opinions and ideas to be considered, that requires the people who haven't had to deal with racism to deal with racism. So it's for some of them, that's painful. It's not even just uninteresting or inconvenient. For some, that's actually painful. So if we're coming from a place of empathy, maybe that's a place to start, because you don't know for whom that might be painful. So that's probably the best answer I have. That's a deep question, Tanisha.
Thank you, Janine. It wasn't my question, so I apologize. Jenice, did you want to respond to the question?
I'm good.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. So we are closing out. So on the behalf of CCS and our panelists, thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We will post the recording on our website, so be on the lookout for that. And we will also send a follow-up email. So I hope everyone have a good weekend. Take care.